It was the autumn of 1886 in the Dakota Territory, and Alara McLeod was building her own tomb, or so the whispers in the settlement of Providence claimed. They watched her from a distance, this solitary widow with the strange accent and the haunted eyes, as she hauled fieldstone from the creek bed. She worked from dawn until the light failed, her hands raw, her back bowed, stacking the stones into a low, circular wall on a windswept rise of land nobody had wanted. She did not build like a carpenter, with plumb lines and soaring frames of timber. She built like a creature of the earth, low and patient. Her work did not resemble the proud, angular log cabins that dotted the valley floor, monuments to the hard-won conquest of the prairie. Hers was a mound, a strange, stony hump that seemed to be growing from the soil itself. It had no grand windows, only narrow slits that looked more like defensive loopholes than sources of light. Silas Croft, the man who had built nearly every proper structure in Providence, declared it an abomination. He watched her one afternoon, his arms crossed over his barrel chest, and shook his head with a certainty born of 2 decades of frontier experience. The men at the trading post echoed his judgment. They called it Alara's folly. As the days grew shorter and a telltale chill sharpened the air, the name soured into something darker. They started calling it the Stone Coffin. They believed the coming winter would prove them right. They believed the unforgiving Dakota cold would turn that pile of rocks into a crypt of ice, entombing the woman and her young son, Leo. What did this quiet woman, an outcast from the misty shores of Scotland, understand about survival that every seasoned trapper and builder on this unforgiving frontier had missed? What secret was she sealing into those cold, silent stones? If you're ready to uncover the answer, subscribe to this channel for more stories of forgotten wisdom, and drop a comment below telling us where you're watching from. To understand her reasoning, you must first understand the enemy. The enemy was not the land, which was generous in the summer. The enemy was the cold. It was a living entity, a predator that stalked the plains from November to April. It was a physical pressure that warped stout timbers and shattered iron. It was a thief that stole the breath from your lungs and the heat from your bones. The winter of 1885 had been a brutal teacher. It had been a season of relentless, lung-searing cold that found every crack and chink in the settlers' defenses. They had built their cabins according to the accumulated wisdom of the American frontier. They felled the thickest logs they could find, notched them with practiced skill, and chinked the gaps with a mixture of mud, moss, and grass. These were sturdy homes capable of turning back a summer storm or a prairie wind. But they were sieves against the great Dakota winter. The cold did not just seep through the walls, it inhabited them. A rime of frost grew on the interior logs, a glittering white fungus that crept closer to the fire each day. Blankets froze stiff where they touched the walls. Ink turned to black ice in its wells. Water left in a pail overnight would be a solid block by morning. The settlers fought back with the only weapon they had: fire. They fed their cast-iron stoves relentlessly, turning them into roaring, cherry-red beasts. The area 3 feet around the stove was survivable, a small island of life in a sea of encroaching frost. But the heat rose directly to the ceiling, leaving the floors perilously cold. And the fire was a ravenous god, a family could burn through a winter's worth of cordwood in 6 weeks. When the woodpile dwindled, they started burning fence posts, then furniture. The problem was fundamental, a flaw in the very physics of their shelters. The log walls, for all their thickness, were poor insulators. Heat passed through the solid wood with surprising ease, radiating out into the negative 30-degree air. The more they heated the inside, the faster that heat escaped. It was a battle of attrition they were destined to lose. Alara MacLeod had watched this losing battle during her first and only winter with her husband, John. She had felt the drafts, seen the frost, and measured the dwindling woodpile with a growing sense of dread. But where others saw an inevitable hardship of frontier life, she saw a profound engineering failure. She saw a design that was fighting the cold head-on, trying to overpower it with brute force. Her mind went back to a different place, a different kind of cold. She was not from the deep, dry freeze of a continent's heart. She was from the Isle of Skye, a place of relentless wind and chilling, damp cold that clung to everything. The cold there was a constant, grinding presence, not a seasonal shock. And the homes of her ancestors had been designed to accommodate it, not to fight it. Section. She remembered her grandfather's croft. It was not built of wood, which was scarce and precious. It was built of the island's bones, stone. It was low to the ground, nestled into the lee of a hill to escape the worst of the gales. And its walls were not solid. They were two walls. This was the memory that haunted her, the piece of old-world knowledge that the proud frontier builders, with their axes and their abundant timber, had never needed to learn. Her grandfather had called it a bala anail, a breathing wall. It was a principle ancient and profound, born from 1,000 years of surviving on a windswept rock in the North Atlantic. After John died of pneumonia that first spring, a sickness she was certain had its roots in the damp, drafty cabin, and his brother used legal maneuvering to take the prime land, leaving her with the barren, stony hill, Alara did not see it as a curse. She saw it as a canvas. She had her son, Leo, to protect. The community offered pity, but no real help. They saw a destitute widow, a burden. She saw a chance to build a shelter that did not fight the winter, but instead understood it. Her work began in late August. She did not clear the land in the conventional sense. She chose a spot dug slightly into the south-facing slope of the hill, gaining the earth itself as a northern barrier. Her foundation was not a square, but a thick, imperfect circle about 18 feet in diameter. With a simple wooden A-frame and a rope, she began hoisting the largest, flattest stones she could manage into place. She was building two distinct walls simultaneously. There was an outer wall, thick and solid, made of the largest stones, fitted together with the slow, patient skill of a puzzle master. Then, separated by a gap of nearly 2 feet, she began constructing an inner wall. This one was made of smaller, smoother stones. She did not use mortar. This was a dry stone construction, a technique that allowed the walls to settle and shift without cracking. The gap between the walls was the heart of her design. It was the principle that the men in the valley could not comprehend. As the walls rose, she meticulously filled this cavity. She did not use mud or simple dirt. She used layers of dry peat she had cut from the creek bank, gravel for drainage at the bottom, and thick, dried turf. It was a filling that was porous, full of millions of tiny pockets of trapped air. Silas Croft made his first official visit in mid-September. He was not an unkind man, but he was a man who believed in right angles and the proven strength of interlocking timbers. He stood inside her partial circle of stone, the wind whistling through the gaps, and surveyed the work with a professional's eye. "Ma'am," he began, his voice laced with a genuine, if condescending, concern. "I cannot stand by and watch you do this. This is not how you build a house." Alara paused, a hand-sized stone in her grasp. "It is how my people build," she said, her voice quiet. "Your people didn't have to face a Dakota winter," Silas countered. He pointed to the wall. "Stone is a conductor. It leaches heat. You're building an ice house. That rock will draw the warmth from your fire and send it straight outside. You'll never be able to keep this place warm." She looked at the gap between her walls. "The stone does not keep the warmth," she explained simply. "The air does." He scoffed, a short, sharp sound of disbelief. "Air? Ma'am, you are wasting your time and what little strength you have, and this is dry stack. The first heavy snow will shift these stones. The wind will push right through the cracks." He kicked at a loose stone at the base. "Let me and a few of the men come up here. We can have a proper cabin framed for you in a week. A small one, but it'll be tight and warm." "I thank you for the offer, Mr. Croft," she replied, turning back to her work and fitting the stone into its place. "But I will see this through." His second visit came a month later, as she was laying the massive stone lintel over the single, low doorway. By now, the mockery in the settlement was in full swing. The stone coffin had become a common joke. Children would dare each other to run up and touch it. This time, Silas brought a new argument, one grounded in the grim realities of prairie dampness. "Have you considered condensation?" he asked, his tone that of a teacher trying to explain a difficult concept to a stubborn child. "When your warm, moist breath hits that cold inner stone wall, the water will turn to liquid. It will run down the stones. Everything you own will be soaked in damp. Then it will freeze. Your blankets, your clothes, the very walls will be coated in a sheet of ice. You are building a tomb." It was a logical, plausible argument. It was based on everything he knew about the physics of cold and shelter. To everyone who heard his reasoning, it was the final, unassailable proof of the widow's madness. Alara simply looked at him, her face smudged with dirt, her expression unreadable. "The wall will breathe," she said. He threw his hands up in exasperation and left. He told the men at the trading post that she was beyond reason. She was a woman gripped by a foolish, old-world pride that would surely kill her and the boy. The community's pity curdled into a kind of grim resignation. They were no longer just watching a fool build a folly. They were watching a tragedy unfold in slow motion. By the first snowfall in early November, the structure was complete. The walls were finished, rising to about 7 feet. For the roof, she did not have the skill for complex timber work. Instead, she laid thick logs of cottonwood across the top, covered them with hides to create a waterproof layer, and then piled on a thick coating of sod nearly 3 feet deep. The entire structure hunkered low, its turf roof already blending into the brown hillside. From a distance, it looked like a natural formation, a burrow. Now, the system could be understood in its entirety. It was not merely a shelter. It was a machine for managing heat. The thick outer stone wall served as the primary windbreak, its mass blunting the force of the prairie gales. The 2-foot gap, filled with its matrix of turf and trapped air, was the true insulation. Air, when held still in small pockets, is one of an engineer's best insulators. It resists the transfer of heat by conduction. This was the principle that Silas Croft, accustomed to solid, conductive logs, had failed to grasp. But the inner wall was the masterstroke. This wall was not insulation. It was a battery. It was a carefully calculated thermal mass. Throughout the day, the heat from her small, efficient stone hearth would not just warm the air in the small circular room. It would soak into the tons of stone that made up that inner wall. The stone would absorb the energy slowly, steadily, like a sponge soaking up water. When the fire was banked for the night, the process would reverse. As the air temperature in the room began to drop, the immense thermal battery of the inner wall would begin to release its stored heat. It would radiate a gentle, even warmth back into the room all through the long, cold night. It was a slow release system. It meant she wouldn't have to keep a roaring fire going 24 hours a day. The very structure of her home was a partner in the work of staying warm. The breathing she spoke of was the final piece. The dry stone construction was not perfectly airtight. Tiny amounts of air could still move through the porous insulation and the unmortared stones. This slow, almost imperceptible air exchange would carry moisture out of the living space, preventing the condensation that Silas had so confidently predicted. It was a lung, slowly inhaling dry air and exhaling dampness, a house that lived and breathed with the seasons. A stone coffin on the outside, a living womb on the inside. December arrived with a biting cold that everyone recognized as the prelude. The temperature hovered in the single digits, and the wind had a familiar, cruel edge. The settlers of Providence settled in for the long fight, checking the chinking on their cabins and the size of their woodpiles. Then, on the second week of the month, the predator came. It arrived not as a blizzard, but as a silent, invisible wave of Arctic air that descended from the north. The sky was a brilliant, cloudless blue, a beautiful and terrifying lie. The temperature at dawn on the first day was 5 degrees below zero. By sunset, it was -20. The old-timers looked at the sky, at the way the smoke from their chimneys rose perfectly straight into the air, and they felt a primal fear. This was no ordinary cold snap. By the morning of the second day, the thermometer at the trading post read -32 degrees Fahrenheit. The mercury was huddled at the bottom of the glass, a silver bead of misery. The world fell silent. The normal sounds of the frontier, the ring of an axe, the lowing of cattle, the shouts of children, were gone, frozen out of existence. The only sound was the sharp crack of freezing trees, their sap turning to ice and splitting the wood with a sound like a rifle shot. Inside the log cabins of Providence, the battle for survival began in earnest. The flaw in their design was now brutally exposed. The extreme cold caused the logs to contract, shrinking just enough to open up microscopic fissures around the chinking. The wind, which had now begun to rise, forced needles of Arctic air through these new gaps. The cabins, once considered tight, were now riddled with invisible wounds. Frost no longer just clung to the walls, it marched across them. It climbed the furniture. It traced delicate, deadly patterns on the blankets of sleeping children. The stoves were pushed to their limits, their iron sides glowing a dull, angry red. They consumed wood at a rate that terrified the families who fed them. A week's supply was gone in 2 days. The heat they produced was immediately stolen by the cold, sucked through the walls and the roof. In his own cabin, the finest in the settlement, Silas Croft was failing. He had built it himself, with prime seasoned oak and the tightest saddle notches in the territory. It was his masterpiece, a testament to his skill, and it was failing. He stood before his stove, a behemoth of cast iron, and could still see his breath crystallize in the air if he moved more than 6 feet away. His wife and 2 daughters were huddled under a mountain of quilts on their bed, their faces pale. He had already burned through 1/3 of his entire winter stock of wood in just 2 days. The number sent a spike of pure panic through him. He was the most prepared man in Providence, and at this rate, he would be out of fuel before January. The cold was not just an inconvenience, it was a mathematical certainty of death. His expertise, his reputation, his pride, all of it was turning to ash in his stove, and it was not enough. On the 3rd day, the wind rose to a gale, and the snow began. It was not a gentle snow, but a fine, hard powder, like sand, that the wind drove into a blinding, horizontal curtain. The temperature, with wind chill, was estimated to be 60 degrees below zero. It was a cold that killed exposed flesh in minutes. The Great White Death, they would later call it, had arrived. And through his own fear, through the haze of wood smoke and anxiety, a thought pricked at Silas's conscience. The widow, the woman on the hill. He pictured her in that stone tomb with her tiny son. He imagined the cold seeping through those unmortared rocks, the condensation forming sheets of ice on the inside, her small fire choked out by the sheer, overwhelming power of the Arctic air. The image was horrifying. He had mocked her. He had led the chorus of ridicule. He had stood by, wrapped in his own certainty, and watched her build what he knew to be a death trap. A wave of guilt, cold and sharp as the wind outside, washed over him. If she and the boy died up there, their blood would be on his hands, on the hands of the whole community. He had to go. He had to see. Perhaps he could bring them back to his own failing cabin, huddle together, share what little warmth they had. It was a desperate, foolish idea, but it was better than doing nothing. The journey was a descent into a frozen hell. It was only 1/2 mile from his cabin to her hill, but it might as well have been 100. He wrapped himself in every layer of wool and fur he owned, until he was a lumbering beast, barely able to move. The wind was a solid wall, trying to tear him off his feet. The snow was not snow. It was a billion tiny knives that scoured his exposed skin and blinded him. He navigated by memory, keeping the faint line of the creek to his left. He couldn't see more than 10 feet in any direction. The world had been reduced to a screaming white void. His beard froze solid. Ice crystals formed on his eyelashes, making it even harder to see. His lungs burned with every breath, the air so cold it felt like swallowing fire. He thought of turning back 12 times, but the image of the boy, Leo, pushed him forward. After what felt like an hour, his foot struck something solid. He stumbled and fell, his hands landing on the rough texture of snow-covered stone. He had found it. He crawled on his hands and knees along the base of the wall, searching for the door. The structure was almost completely buried in a deep drift, its low profile having allowed the wind and snow to simply flow over it. It was a part of the landscape now, He found the thick plank door, brushed away the snow, and pounded on it with a frozen fist. The sound was a dull, dead thud, swallowed by the roar of the wind. He pounded again, shouting her name, his voice snatched away and lost in the gale. For a moment, there was nothing. He sagged against the wall, a terrible certainty settling in his gut. He was too late. They were already gone. He was about to turn away when he heard a faint sound from within, the scraping of a wooden bar. The door swung inward. The moment of revelation was not a sound or a sight. It was a physical force. A wave of warmth washed over him, so profound and shocking that he recoiled. It was not the scorching, dry heat of an overworked stove, but a deep, gentle, radiant warmth. It felt like standing in the sun on a calm spring day. It was impossible. He stumbled across the threshold, pulling the door shut against the raging storm, and stood there, blinking, utterly disoriented. The scene before him defied every law of physics he knew. The circular room was bathed in a soft, steady light from a tallow lamp. In the center of the room, on a circular braided rug, sat her son, Leo. The boy was not bundled in furs. He was barefoot, wearing only a simple wool shirt and trousers, happily stacking small wooden blocks. Barefoot. The word screamed in Silas's mind. Alara stood by the stone hearth. She was in her shirt sleeves. Her face, illuminated by the small, calm fire, was serene. She was not fighting for survival. She was living. Steam rose from a small pot of stew simmering over the flames. The air did not smell of damp and desperation. It smelled of food and wood smoke and the unbelievable scent of baking bread. He looked at the walls, the very stones he had predicted would be coated in ice. They were bare. They were dry. They were, impossibly, warm to the touch. He reached out a trembling, gloved hand and pressed it against the inner wall. It felt like sun-baked rock in July. He was an expert builder. His entire identity was built on his knowledge of structure, of heat, of cold. In the space of 10 seconds, his entire worldview had been shattered. He was not looking at a shelter. He was looking at a miracle. He began to investigate, his mind trying to process the data his senses were giving him. He walked the circumference of the room, touching the walls. All of them, even the north-facing wall that took the brunt of the wind, radiated a gentle, persistent heat. He looked at the ceiling, the thick sod roof. There were no drips, no signs of frost. He looked at the floor, made of large, flat flagstones. It was cool, but not cold. The boy was barefoot. Finally, his gaze fell upon the woodpile. It was nestled in a small alcove near the hearth. It was small, far too small. His own woodpile, which had been 3 times the size, was now half gone. Hers looked almost untouched. This was the data point that broke the last of his resistance. This was the inarguable number that turned his world upside axle. "How?" he croaked, his voice raw from the cold. "How is this possible?" Alara looked at him, her expression not of triumph, but of simple, weary understanding. "The walls are breathing," she said, "and they hold the heat." "The fire," he said, pointing a shaking finger. "It's so small. You can't heat a space with a fire that small in this cold." "I am not heating the space," she explained patiently. I am heating the stone. The stone heats the space. He stared at the inner wall, finally understanding. It was a battery. A massive stone battery that was slowly, efficiently releasing the energy she had fed it hours ago. He thought of his own stove, roaring its life out, the vast majority of its heat going straight up the chimney or bleeding through the logs. He was trying to fill a bucket with a hole in the bottom. She had built a different kind of bucket. He did the mental math, a quick, desperate calculation. The size of her woodpile, the size of her fire, the temperature in the room. He estimated it was at least 65 degrees inside. Outside, it was -30, with a wind that made it feel like -60, a temperature differential of nearly 100 degrees. Maintained with a fire a child could tend. The numbers were not just undeniable, they were revolutionary. He finally took off his frozen gloves and heavy coat, his body trembling as it adjusted to the warmth. He looked at this woman, this quiet, stubborn widow the entire town had mocked and condemned. This woman who had faced the same apocalyptic cold as them, not with brute force, but with ancient, elegant wisdom. She had not built a coffin. She had built the safest home in the entire Dakota Territory. He sank onto a small wooden stool, the strength gone from his legs. He looked at his hands, the hands of a master builder, calloused and capable. They were the hands of a fool. "I was wrong," Silas said. The words felt heavy and inadequate in his mouth. He looked up at her, his eyes meeting hers, and for the first time, he saw not a crazy woman, but a genius. "I was completely and utterly wrong. You have to teach me. You have to teach us all how this works." The Great White Death raged for 2 more days. When the storm finally broke, it left behind a world transformed, buried under feet of snow and scoured by the wind. The settlement of Providence, slowly, painfully, came back to life. They took stock of their losses. Dozens of livestock had frozen to death in their barns. Several outlying cabins had been abandoned, their owners seeking shelter with neighbors. 2 trappers who had been caught out on the plains were never found. The first person to emerge from the drifts was Silas Croft. But he did not go to his own home. He went to the trading post, where the few men brave enough to venture out had gathered, their faces grim and frost-nipped. He stood before them, and in a voice filled with a convert's zeal, he told them what he had seen. He told them about the wave of warmth. He told them about the boy playing barefoot on the floor. He described the dry, warm stone walls and the tiny, efficient fire. He told them the numbers, the nearly 100-degree temperature difference, the fraction of wood she had used compared to them. They listened in stunned silence. There was no mockery now. Silas Croft was the most respected builder among them. His word was bond. If he said it was true, it was true. The name they had invented to mock her, the stone coffin, died on their lips that day. It was never spoken again. In its place, a new name began to circulate, first in whispers, then in open conversation: the Highland House. When Alara finally emerged from her home, she did not find a crowd of gawkers. She found a small, humbled delegation led by Silas Croft. They brought gifts of smoked meat and flour. They did not ask for a tour. They asked for lessons. And so, Alara MacLeod, the outcast widow, became a teacher. She did not lecture. She showed. She walked them through the principles of the breathing wall, of thermal mass, of working with the environment instead of against it. She explained that the outer wall was a shield, the gap was the blanket, and the inner wall was the hearthstone. Silas, her first and most important student, absorbed every word, translating her quiet, accented explanations into the practical language of builders. That spring, a revolution in architecture began in the small valley of Providence. The first to be retrofitted was Silas Croft's own cabin. He spent a month building a thick, insulated stone wall inside his existing log structure, creating a massive thermal battery around his hearth. The difference, even in the mild spring weather, was noticeable. The house held the day's warmth long into the cool nights. The next summer, no new log cabins were built. Instead, crews of men, supervised by Silas and often quietly observed by Alara, began constructing 3 new highland houses for families who had lost the most in the storm. They learned to read the land, to site the homes to take advantage of the sun and shelter from the wind. They learned the patient, mortarless art of dry stacking stone. The folly on the hill became the blueprint for their survival. In the years that followed, the settlement of Providence became known for its unique, energy-efficient homes. Travelers passing through would marvel at the strange, low, sod-roofed stone houses that dotted the valley. The design was adapted and modified. Some incorporated more windows on the south side to capture solar heat, a passive design principle Alara had intuitively understood. Her legacy was not written in books or carved on monuments. It was written in the lives that were saved in the winters that followed. It was measured in the diminished wood piles, the comfort of families, the quiet dignity of a warm home in the heart of a blizzard. It was measured in the babies who survived their first winters, in children who could play on the floor without fear of frostbite, in the simple, profound luxury of rolling up your sleeves indoors while a gale howled outside. Alara never sought fame or payment. She had done what she set out to do. She had kept her boy warm. That was enough. The story of Alara MacLeod and her Highland house is a powerful lesson. It speaks to the conflict between entrenched tradition and disruptive innovation, and the arrogance of dismissing an idea simply because it is unfamiliar. The settlers of Providence were not foolish. They were using the best knowledge they had. But their knowledge was incomplete, born of a different set of environmental challenges. Alara brought a new perspective, an ancient wisdom honed by a different kind of hardship. Her success was a victory for empirical evidence over popular opinion. The principles she used, thermal mass, super insulation via an air gap, and passive solar siting, are not relics of the past. They are foundational concepts in modern sustainable architecture and green building. The breathing wall finds its modern cousin in the rain screen systems and ventilated facades of today's most advanced buildings. What did a lone widow on the Dakota Prairie understand? She understood physics. Not from a book, but from a deeper, ancestral knowledge of how to build a shelter that did not just defy the cold, but collaborated with it. If this story of ingenuity and vindication resonated with you, hit that like button to help us share it with others. Subscribe to our channel for more explorations of forgotten engineering and frontier wisdom. And let us know in the comments, what's the coldest winter you have ever had to endure? The story you have just heard is a fictionalized account created for educational and entertainment purposes. While the engineering and physics principles of thermal mass, air gap insulation, and passive solar design are real and historically significant, the specific characters, names, locations, and events depicted are products of creative storytelling. This narrative does not constitute professional engineering or construction advice.